Hi, you're listening to WPVM FM in Asheville, North Carolina, 1037 on your dial, and globally at WPVMFM.org. We're also going to have the show on Facebook, so we look forward to seeing you on Facebook, or you're listening to us on WPVM. I'm Chuck Fink, and I'm your host of Storyville. We're going to be on every Wednesday at 10 o'clock. So, what is Storyville? Well, quite simply, Storyville is a show about storytelling and storytellers within our community of Asheville and, quite frankly, from around the globe, now that we have Zoom. The purpose is for your audience, for our audience, to get to know our tellers a little bit better and also to listen to some of their stories. And today we are so fortunate. This is our very first show, and it's the very first episode of the show that will appear every Wednesday. We are so fortunate to have as our first guest for the entire hour, Donna Marie Todd. Donna Marie is, and here's Donna Marie now. There we go. Hi, Donna Marie, how are you? Donna Marie, where are you? Well, anyway, Donna Marie will soon appear. I think she's about to come on screen. And let me tell you a little bit about Donna Marie as she starts to enter the room. Donna Marie Todd is foremost and first a storyteller. She's a popular blogger and broadcaster, and she's the author of Navigating Loss, a survival guide for the newly widowed, and she's a TEDx speaker. Donna Marie travels through the United States speaking for conferences and storytelling for festivals. Donna Marie is a certified grief recovery specialist, and she believes in the healing power of stories and that is the best medicine for recovering from life hurts. And Donna Marie, I sure understand that. Donna Marie is president of the Asheville Storytelling Circle, and I've been a member for about 3 years. And when it comes to leadership, Donna Marie is our leader. She's incredible. She's also a member of the North Carolina Storytelling Guild and the National Storytelling Network. And she's the she's the editor of the Biblical Storytelling magazine for the network of Biblical Storytellers International. And as she tells her story, I think you'll see why. You can learn more about her storytelling work by visiting DonnaMarieTodd.com. And if you're more interested, you can check her book online at awidowstale.com. Hi, Donna Marie, how are you?
Hey, Chuck, I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good, considering
Great.
It's COVID and we're all inside. We're speaking on Zoom.
I know. Isolation is such an odd thing.
Well, before we start all the regular questions, you had a picnic that I was unable to attend on Sunday.
Oh.
It was for the Asheville Storytelling Circle, and it's our annual picnic. Can you describe a little bit about what went on and the activities?
Well, now let's see. First off, when you get a whole group of storytellers together, you know you're going to have storytelling. So we had some fantastic storytelling. We had a story about a man fresh out of the Navy who ended up on somebody's tall sailing ship. And they left the harbor in calm water and ended up in the middle of a terrible storm as soon as they left the harbor. And it turned out that you didn't really have to have any training to have a captain's license. And the man captaining the boat didn't know what he was doing. So that was fun. But they all survived, and that was a fun story to hear. We heard a story about bringing joy to other people and how often it's just the little things that we do that really make somebody else's day, Chuck, and that really give other people permission to not only share their hurts, but to be who they're going to be in the world. We heard a story, let me think. We heard a story about a seminarian's first experience with baptism and learning the rules of the church. That was pretty interesting, meaning the rules of the people who put the money in the offering plate. And I told a story that you're going to hear in a few minutes about a family reunion. And there were others too. I can't remember all of them. They were absolutely fantastic. Oh, one was about starting school, since the school year is just now starting, and starting school way back when all of us were kids. We gathered socially distanced, and we were in my huge backyard because the state and local parks are closed. And we just enjoyed an afternoon of fellowship, non-hugging, social distancing, wearing masks, but getting to see each other's eyeballs for the first time in 6 months. So that was
You,
good.
you just summarized storytellers when you said oddballs. I don't know if we're all oddballs, but our lives certainly are worth telling in stories.
They
So
are.
I just so appreciate what you've done.
Oh,
And
thank you,
now
Chuck.
let's just talk about you. So
Oh,
how did you get involved in storytelling? How did it begin?
oh, wow. Well, Chuck, I'm from the hills of West Virginia, and I was born the Vestal Virgin daughter of a United Methodist pastor and his organist wife, and I was literally cradled into storytelling.
So you started with storytelling, and it seems like one of your best stories that you tell about your growing up and years beyond is called The Quilt. Can you give us
Yes.
an example from The Quilt?
Yeah, I'd love to tell you a little excerpt from that. The quilt itself is about an hour-long show and kind of centers around the fact that my matriarchal grandmother was a quilter, among other things, and she pieced together our family's lives from little pieces of fabric. You see, Chuck, when I was a little kid, you did not go to the mall to get new clothes. You went to the family reunion and you took a poke, which is West Virginia for sack. You took a sack of all the clothes that no longer fit you or that you would refuse to wear anymore, and you would take them to the family reunion. And upstairs in my Aunt Jane's big 2-story white farmhouse, there was one room for boys and one room for girls. You put your sack in the appropriate room, and then all of my cousins brought their clothes. There were about 16 of us all together. And you took home what other people couldn't wear that you could still wear. Now, when you could no longer or would no longer wear something in that poke, then that went into grandma's poke. And a year or so later, it would show up as a piece of a quilt or as a rag rug. Waste not, want not was my grandmother's theme. She was a bride of the Great Depression, and she used everything until she used it up. Her husband used to say that she used every part of the pig but the squeal. That's a little bit about the kind of family I came from. But one of my favorite memories as a child was traveling to the family reunion, because you see, my family were Welsh Methodist. We were singing Welsh Methodist. And so we would sing on the way to the family reunion, and we would sing all of our favorite songs. Now, my father's favorite song, Chuck, went something like this. It's an old mountain song called the Riddle Song. Tell me why the stars do shine. Tell me why the ivy twines. Tell me why the ocean's blue. And I will tell you just why I love you. Because God made the stars to shine. Because God made the ivy twine. Because God made the ocean blue. Because God made you. That's why I love you. Now, when we would pull up next to my Aunt Jane's big 2-story white farmhouse on her big farm, we entered the most painful moment of the trip, because that was the moment when we had to peel our tender young skin up off the hot aldehyde of that car. You see, this was in the days before air conditioning, and it was always late July or early August, and it was wicked hot. And you had to carefully get yourself out of the car by hopping across the seat before that hot aldehyde could have a chance to burn tender, untasted virgin flesh. When you got out of the car, that hot aldehyde had branded the back of your thighs with a faux alligator pattern that you wore for several hours later. You would fan off your rear end, and then we would run down the old flagstone walk that led up to my Aunt Jane's farmhouse, and we would pull that screen door, and before we could even open it and get inside, a voice from inside would say, "Don't you slam that door, young lady." Now, I don't know about your family reunions, Chuck, but in the mountains of West Virginia, family reunions are really very thinly veiled forums for child-rearing critique, and door slamming was considered the mark of a particularly unruly child. And the voice belonged to my Aunt Jane. My mother and her sisters would duel like Olympic swordsmen over the behavior of their kids. Aunt Jane would draw her sword first. Whoosh! Now, Pearl, does that girl slam the door at your house or just when she's at mine? Never one to turn down a fight. My mother would push my sister and myself to safety behind the potluck table, and then she would unsheath her weapon. Whoosh! Now, Jane, I don't think she was going to slam the door, were you, dear? And was that Dale I saw outside? I barely recognized him. He'd gained so much weight. And they would spar, while my sister and I would slowly rise and take in the miracle that is a West Virginia potluck table, laden heavy with food. There were 3 kinds of deviled eggs with olives, deviled eggs with mustard, and deviled eggs with mayonnaise. There were 2 kinds of fried chicken with batter and fried chicken with cornflakes. And then there was 3 bean salad. You know, Chuck, to this day, I don't know who eats that. And then in a big bowl, there were my Aunt Jane's homemade yeast rolls, each one the size of a softball and light as a feather, her husband liked to say. And because this was West Virginia and it was a farm, next to those big rolls was a crock of freshly churned butter from Betsy the cow outside. And there were jams and jellies of every description, gooseberry jelly and blackberry jam. And then at the end of the table was the queen of the potluck, the molded salad. Remember those? Sometimes they were orange, sometimes they were red. They had fruit on the inside, and then on the top they had a thick layer of icing. Oh, they were so good. And then over on the white enamel stove were glasses of my Aunt Jane's just sweet enough iced tea. And just as we were ready to reach for one of those, we were interrupted, and Aunt Jane would say, "Has your grandma seen you yet?" Now, I told you I had a matriarchal grandmother. And at the family reunion, her throne was this rusty metal lawn chair out on the front porch. And no child was free to do anything at the family reunion until they had had their audience with grandma. So you would go out on the front porch and you would curtsy to the queen and you would say, "Well, good afternoon, Grandma. How are you?" And she would look at you like she had no idea who you were. And she would say to Uncle John, "Well, law me, John, now who is this?" She knew exactly who you were, because if you had any hairs out of place or if you had a watermelon stain on your shirt already, you were chastised on the front porch by Grandma. And then once you were chastised, you got a hug. And it was a big, warm hug, one that made you felt loved all the way down to your bones. And then you were free to go. And we would leap off the front porch to go down and play in the Sulphur Creek while Uncle John hollered after us, "Don't you kids play in that Sulphur Creek, you'll stain your clothes." Now our outdoor expeditions were always led by Cousin Paul. Because Cousin Paul had grown up on a farm. And he knew things, important things. "Hey, Donna Marie, guess how kittens is really made?" Oh, no. Cousin Paul knew what lived in those little holes that lined the creek bed, but he wouldn't tell you. He would make you stick your finger down in that crawdaddy hole and find the claw for yourself. Oh! Just about the time you got really tired of playing follow the leader with Cousin Paul, Cousin Lewis would show up. Cousin Lewis was older than the rest of us, and he was so handsome, he could have been a movie star. But he was going one better. He was going to be a doctor. And even though he was older, he was still kind of a kid, but just because he was almost a grown-up, he knew what kids had been doing, no matter what kids said they'd been doing. And he'd always look at us and say, "Oh, law, May, look at you kids, you're a mess. You get up to the house and get washed up. And don't you use my mama's kitchen sink. You wash up outside. You hear me, Paul?" And so Paul would lead the way up to the farmhouse, and he would pump that old pump that led to the first well they'd had, and out would splash this icy cold mountain water, and we would splash it all over our faces and take off all the sweat and all that crawdaddy goo. And then we'd all circle up on the front porch, and we'd hold hands, and my daddy would say the blessing. Now, it was a particular point of pride with my grandmother that when it came time to have the blessing at her family reunion, that she had a professional to do the job. And so she would linger over my daddy's name a little bit. She'd say, "Reverend Ross, will you bless us, please, Reverend?" And my daddy would say the prayer. And he'd always end it the same way. He'd say, "And Lord, we just thank you that we're a family once again." And then blam, we'd all run for the kitchen to get that potluck, but no way. This was in the days, Chuck, before child entitlement. Grown-ups went first at our family reunion. And by the time us kids got in there, all the good stuff was gone. Well, just about. But you'd take one of those paper plates. I mean, now these were real paper plates, not Chinette. And you had to balance them on your hand, just so, remember? Or all the food would fall off. And you'd get a deviled egg with olive, and a deviled egg with mustard, and a deviled egg with mayonnaise. You'd get a piece of fried chicken with seasoned batter, and a piece of fried chicken with cornflakes. Then one of Aunt Jane's big yeast rolls would go down right in the middle. You'd top that with a whole bunch of freshly churned butter, some gooseberry jelly, and some blackberry jam. "Oh, no, ma'am, I don't care for any 3-bean salad. Thank you, Aunt Jane." And then you'd make room on your plate for the molded salad. And you would take one scoop, extra icing off the top, and another scoop. And then you'd get some of that, just sweet enough iced tea. And we'd go out on the front porch and we'd drink our tea. And we'd eat our fried chicken. And we would eat until we were so full we could barely move. And when we were finished eating, the grown-ups were still talking. They'd barely touched their food. They were so busy criticizing each other's kids. And so we'd give each other the secret wink and the nudge. And then us kids would get up one by one so as not to attract any attention. And we'd go back into the kitchen in search of the desserts. And there were chocolate chip cookies. And we'd fill our pockets with those for the road. And then because it was West Virginia, there were cobblers of all kinds. Peach cobbler, apple cobbler, berry cobbler. Then there was Grandma's mile-high lemon meringue pie. And that was only for the grown-ups, and we all knew it. And then at the end of the counter was our prize. A big, warm, freshly iced sheet cake. And my cousin Paul, he'd take out his pocket knife. You did not want to know where that had been. It always had things clinging to it. But he'd wipe it on his pants and disinfect it. And then he'd make one long horizontal cut, disinfect it on his pants, and 2 long vertical cuts, and then he would scoop out a piece of chocolate cake for each of us kids the size of a brick. And we'd get more of that just sweet enough iced tea. And we'd go out to the side porch where the grown-ups couldn't see us, and we would eat our cake, and we would drink that sweet iced tea until we were so hopped up on sugar. And we would leap off that porch and we would hoot and holler around in the front yard, chocolate cake smeared across our faces like Indian war paint. And we'd hoot and holler around there until the night started to fall and the fireflies came out. Oh, there's one, I see one. And as we started catching fireflies, Aunt Jane would show up with Uncle John. She'd have the old cannon jars from a few years before. And Uncle John, he'd take an ice pick and he'd poke holes in the top of them jars, in the top of the lids. And then he'd give each of us kids a jar. And we'd put our fireflies down in those jars when we caught them. Oh, there's one, I've got it. There's another one, I got it. And then we would carry those jars up to the front porch, and we would put them down in front of Grandma, like the Magi bringing gifts to the baby Jesus. And by the time the night fell over those West Virginia hills like a velvet curtain coming down across the clouds, we were all family once again. Because God loves you, that's why I love you.
Oh, Donna Marie, that I'd never heard that story before, and I've heard a few
God.
of yours, but oh my goodness, that was just so special in so
Oh,
many
thank you.
ways.
Thank you.
First of all, you're a singer, and some storytellers are singers. I'm not one of those, so I'm always impressed by someone who could put the music and the song in their stories.
Well, you know, Chuck, I started out in Grand Opera. Yes, I did.
So there's a little bit of training with that
A little bit of
voice.
training there. Yeah, I took my vocal training at the Peabody Conservatory of Music in Baltimore, Maryland. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well,
Yeah.
this is stuff I never knew, Donna Marie.
Right?
It's so good to get to know you again.
Right. And we had to take accent class, and that's where I started playing around with voices. And we had to learn how to play men because, you know, originally in opera, just as in theater, just back in Shakespeare's day, for instance, there were no women in opera. All female roles were played by castrati, young male singers. And so we had to learn how to do what's called trouser roles. And so I learned how to play all different kinds of characters there. And it was great training for what I do now, I'll tell you that.
Boy, again, you're multi-talented.
Right?
But I got to talk about a couple things. You mentioned
Okay.
my favorite food. It's manna from heaven. That's deviled eggs. Deviled eggs. I'm so glad we moved from Cincinnati to the South where I could really enjoy real deviled eggs.
Right?
The other thing is you mentioned a word that I've only heard from my wife and her folks who are from New England, from Massachusetts. And it was wicked hot. The word wicked to mean very is very New England, but apparently also very West Virginia and very Appalachian. That I didn't know.
Well, you know what? I think maybe the word wicked might have slipped in from my summers spent in Maine, where they talk about
There you
things
go.
being wicked. Yeah, when I was at the conservatory, I spent my summers in Maine performing.
That explains it, as Ricky
There you
Ricardo would
go.
say.
It
Wow.
slipped in there.
The other thing that struck me is storytelling has a place in our legends, in our folklore, in our history, in our lives. It teaches, it brings together families, it carries on traditions. And yours, it showed that gift so well. And for me, having moved and my parents were Southerners from Atlanta and from Nashville. So to me, storytelling is so rich in Appalachia. Whoops, there goes the station ID. Folks, this is our first time. Stuff like that's going to happen. But again, Appalachia is, for me, the motherland of storytelling. And you just incorporated that so well. So I got to ask you a few more questions, if you don't mind.
Sure, absolutely.
What's it like to be a professional storyteller? I entered those ranks. I started in 2012, entered the ranks about 2014. But you've been there a long time. I don't know the ages or anything, but you've been there a while. So how did you what's it like to be a professional?
It's a lot of fun. It's also a lot of lonely hours on the road. It's a lot of spending time in your own head. And it's a very rewarding thing, Chuck. The longer I'm a storyteller, the more aware I am of the sheer power of storytelling. You see, storytelling is our most innate communication form. So we all know how to do it. And we learn from story in ways that we don't learn from anything else. When we enter a story, we're walking around inside somebody else's life, and we're seeing their life circumstance, and we're seeing what happens to them along the way. And then we're connecting automatically, neurologically, to our own memories and to our own ideas. And story teaches by simply letting us put on the moccasins of someone else, to quote the American Indians, and walk around in their shoes for a little while. And that's a very powerful process. I just want to kind of throw in here that when I first entered the field, I did it for the purpose of entertainment, frankly. And it didn't take me very long to figure out that it was a very powerful entertainment medium, and one that would allow me to use my writing and my singing, my performing. I've been performing professionally since I was 16. So I knew it was a medium that was all encompassing. What I didn't realize was the science of how story works between a teller and a listener. And a few years ago, I became aware of the neurological research out there through my son. We'll just call him Mr. Science, who's a biologist and neuroscientist. And they've actually done these very sophisticated brain imaging scans where they have discovered that the parts of the brain responsible for sensory memory actually light up in the listener at the same time they're lighting up in the storyteller's brain. So it's called interlocutory coupling, and we're actually coupled together when we tell story. Is that amazing or what?
Donna Marie, again, I'm learning so much about you and now your family.
Right? Yeah.
You're all so inspiring.
Well, isn't that astounding though? And
Oh,
so it really explains, like, so Chuck, I know you've had this experience because you're an incredible storyteller in your own right. And I know you lead storytelling at UNCA's Senior Learning Center, Ollie. Yeah. And here's the thing. Have you ever told a story and then you finish telling the story and someone in the audience comes up to you and they say, you know what I love best about that story? And they tell you something that wasn't in the story.
Oh, I could tell you stories about that
Right?
very thing.
You could tell me stories about stories that people have told you about your stories, right?
Exactly. You, again, I'm just so impressed by the science behind storytelling.
Yes.
I knew that it connected because my background included working as a trainer, business and nonprofit trainer. And I realized very early on, if you just teach, they're going to be bored to death. So I use stories, and I didn't know about the science, the neurological science, but sure enough, the folks would just light up and they would start to learn. And it was the stories that caused the learning. It wasn't the information. I'm thinking of Einstein's quote, imagination is more important than knowledge.
Yes.
And storytelling really encompasses that.
Well, storytelling is a wormhole into the imagination of the listener, and it can go places other things can't go. So the longer I'm a professional storyteller, Chuck, the more I respect the power of the medium, and the more I start to think as I'm preparing a story, whose life might I touch in a way I had not intended? And to become more and more and more intentional about how I use story, and especially in these really dark times of ours, how to encourage people
and
to
with your
accept the
stories,
dark.
and with your stories about empathy, and you're saying in our dark times right now, that's what we need. Boy, we could use a really healthy dose of that. So thank you again for that. You were president, or you're still president of the Asheville Storytelling Circle. There's no coup involved.
Just to make sure I could still be there.
This is not a coup. This is just a poorly worded question. As president, can you tell us a little bit about the circle, what it is, what it does?
The Asheville Storytelling Circle, Chuck, you're a member, so I know you are kind of aware of this. We're one of the oldest and most established storytelling circles in the country. We have at least 7 working professionals in our group, so I think we kind of hold the record for the largest number of professional and semi-professional storytellers of any circle in the country. We have 2 major events that we put on for the public every year. Both of them happen at the Folk Arts Center on the Blue Ridge Parkway. The one closest to us right now is the Telebration, which is always the Sunday before Thanksgiving. And because of COVID this year, it will be a virtual festival. But if you want to learn more about that, you can go to the Asheville Storytelling Facebook page or to AshevilleStorytellingCircle.org and purchase online tickets for that event. We also put on a spring show. And in past years, we have featured student tellers, which has been very exciting at our spring show. But both of those shows are open to the public. And then we meet on the 3rd Monday of every month. Right now, we're meeting by Zoom. So again, if you would be interested in receiving a link to our Zoom meetings, you can just email me at donnamarie@donnamarietodd.com, and I will see to it that you get an invitation.
Oh, that's so kind. By
Yeah.
the way, a little earlier, we were talking about the tradition of storytelling, the
Mm,
value of storytelling, and
mm,
how it stirs the imagination. I use the Einstein quote. I actually call myself on my webpage an imagination instigator. And
yes.
really, that's what we all do. I have another sub question here. You mentioned professional and semi professional. What's the difference?
Semi-professionals are people who do not rely on storytelling as their primary income, but who are more than good enough to stand on a stage with a pro who does.
Ah,
um,
okay.
and frequently, Chuck, they're retired people who have had a very successful career in another business and who, like you, may have used storytelling. For instance, we have a member who comes from the industry of sales. And he was a top drawer salesman, and it really shows when he goes to sell you a story. You know, you've heard a good story. We have other people who are retired librarians, retired teachers, and they tell stories not so much for as an income base, but more as a way just to celebrate the art form itself.
Uh, so I thought I was professional, but by that description, I must be semi-professional because I got to tell you, I'm retired, and that's why I teach at Ollie. I teach a storytelling class at Ollie for retirees, and I
Right.
guess that yeah, I'm more semi, thanks to the definition. So, are there any upcoming programs that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, the Celebration one in the fall is probably our next big event. All of my events right now have been canceled. I travel most of the year as a storyteller, presenting for conferences and festivals and things like that. And all of them have been canceled this year for COVID. So I'm doing all of my work online now with Zoom and other platforms. So in terms of live storytelling, if you missed the picnic this Sunday, I think you might be out of luck until 2021.
Okay. Yes, and I think we're all looking forward to being able to see each other and
I
connect with
know.
one another live. This is great. It's just the two of us.
I
But
know.
with
It's great
a
to
large
see.
audience, it's really tough to get that feedback that we really love when we're on stage.
Well, you know what's interesting? I was just having a conversation with a couple of other professional tellers earlier last week about the fact that Zoom and Google Hangout and filming yourself for YouTube, all of these things are really film. They're not live performance. So there's a huge difference between performing for a camera and performing for an audience. And I also have a background in film and TV and radio. So I've been performing a very long time. So that the minute the whole virtual world presented itself as the only way I was going to be able to do anything this year, I immediately started thinking, okay, how do I make that transition in my storytelling from live performance? Because I'm a very physical teller, use my body a lot, use my voice a lot, use postures and adapt characterizations in my body a lot. You know, how am I going to change all that to adapt to the medium of film? And that's been very challenging.
Wow. And by the way, a quick interruption because we got to keep our station alive in front of the
Yes, we
FCC.
do.
I'm Chuck Fink, the host of Storyville, and you are listening to Donna Marie Todd on WPVM FM and globally on WPVMFM.org. And you will also be able to see this on my Facebook page and on the station's Facebook page. So there we go. We just complied with the law. I have
Yay.
to ask you a question about your uniqueness. There is
Hmm.
something about you, Donna Marie, and the stories you tell that are very unique. What do you bring to make that happen?
Well, we already talked a little bit about the background, just in terms of training. I have studied with Metropolitan Opera sopranos. I have studied with Broadway actors. I have studied with film actors. I have spent my time learning my crafts, plural. And then when I discovered storytelling, I pulled all of those, and I'm a writer too, and I pulled all of those into the field of storytelling. So I think that's part of my uniqueness.
Hmm.
Um, so part of it is training.
You know, you mentioned your, your uniqueness, and I have to say, with all of your background, you are one of the most unique tellers I know. And I have to
Oh,
say, I got started in storytelling in 2012. I had my first acting role, and I actually had 17 parts in Gypsy. They were all really short. It was hard to remember the lines. I'm sorry, it was 4 roles with 17 lines, and they were
wow.
difficult to remember. Then I tried stand-up comedy until they told me to sit down and shut up.
Woo!
But then I found storytelling where you can actually combine humor and comedy with performance, and it is so much better. I might also add that storytellers and the community of storytellers are so warm and engaging and encouraging and supportive. Where those two other fields, they can be a little bit competitive. We're not.
A little bit competitive? Oh, opera, theater. I've also done comedy, although not stand-up. I did sketch comedy. I had a comedy company back in the day in Memphis, Tennessee. But yeah, in other mediums, artistic mediums, it's a very dog eat dog, back scratching kind of world. And storytelling, you're right, Chuck. I hadn't really thought about it in that way, but yes, we tend to be very supportive and warm toward other tellers. And I think part of that is that each storyteller brings something so unique to what they're doing. So, you could hear the same story. For instance, it would be fun some night at Story Circle to just take one story and ask everybody to learn it, and then to listen to how many versions of that story we could hear with the storytellers that night, because each storyteller makes a story their own, and their own life experiences come into the coloring of the story, of the wording in the story, of the way they interpret who the characters are. So I think that's one of those really beautiful things about story. I appreciate your saying that.
Well, I appreciate your idea, because I look forward to having one story, having all of us share that in our own unique voice.
Fun. That would be fun. I would love that.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I think another thing that makes me a little different is that I've had some fairly difficult life experiences in the last 15 years to work my way through. And those life experiences have a way of scraping away all your shiny veneer, all the layers of this is who I'd like for you to see me as that we put on. It just kind of like it's sandpaper. Life can be like sandpaper sometimes, and it just rubs you until you're raw. And then once you get raw like that, then you find this internal self that is the true you. And I have spent a lot of time over the last 15 years being scratched raw by sandpaper, and learning to claim my authentic self, and learning to be vulnerable when I tell stories. And so while I might not claim that as a uniqueness, a lot of people that I work with and work for do claim that as a uniqueness. And as I've gone through that process of learning to claim my most authentic self, which is something, by the way, I know you've done too. I've heard you tell stories about this, and finding your vulnerable self and having the guts, Chuck, to bring your vulnerable self to the world. That is huge. But when we do that, then we give everybody else permission to do exactly the same thing. And then we don't have to pretend anymore, which is so beautiful.
You mentioned earlier about when you tell a story, having people come up, and I'll tell the story eventually on the show, but I'm not going to tell it now. But it's about my own journey into mental health. Mm-hmm. And I use the term that, and it's very important to me, say, I don't have a disorder. I'm not broken. I don't need to be fixed. Right. After telling that story at the Folk Arts Center, a woman came up with muscular dystrophy, and she had a great deal of difficulty walking, but she came up in tears and thanked me, because saying, for the first time in my life, I don't have to carry my self-imposed stigma. I can see myself as having a condition, not being broken. Right. That's the stuff that keeps us going. And also, it leads into my next question for you, Donna Marie. How did you become a certified grief recovery specialist?
Well, that journey came out of a lot of death. My mother was a 43-year breast cancer survivor, and she moved here to Black Mountain to live with my husband and child and myself, along with my dad. We thought we were going to be taking care of my daddy, who had end-stage Parkinson's, but it turned out that right after she moved here, she developed metastatic disease for the first time in 43 years. So I cared for her for 2 years before she passed. And then my dad's Parkinson's began to take him down, so I took care of him until he passed. And then my dad had been dead about 10 months when I had the most unusual New Year's of my life. My husband, Perrin, was a true Southern gentleman. He was an extreme athlete. He ran, he cycled, he swam. If you could die doing it, he loved to do it. Driving fast cars, he had a racing license, mountain biking at night in the dark with a little miner's helmet with a light on. He loved all of that. He was a great husband, Chuck. He was a wonderful dad. He was a businessman, a Rotarian, an Eagle Scout, a Scoutmaster. He was, 6'2", jet black hair, deep blue eyes, never sick a day in his life. He just had this one little tiny fault. He was born in Alabama, so he didn't know how to do housework. Because you see, it's against the law for a man to do housework in Alabama. And so, Chuck, when my husband came to me on January the 1st and said that he was going to vacuum the house and do the laundry, I thought he had the Nang fever and needed to be hospitalized or something. Until he told me that it was actually our 15-year-old son who was going to vacuum the house. And that did not go over well. Our son, Mr. Science, drug his dad out in the hall and he said, "Dad, what are you doing? You are going to ruin everything with Mom." And then that big buck and that little buck locked horns out in the hall. And when it was all over, Chuck, the little buck plugged in his earbuds and he vacuumed the carpet. Now, usually on New Year's Eve, we stayed up and we listened and watched Lord of the Rings with surround sound, snarling orcs clubbing each other. But not this year. No. This year, my husband wanted to go to bed at 10 o'clock at night. And I was so happy that we were going to bed and not watching Lord of the Rings that I remember I was singing as I brushed my teeth, "Happy New Year to me, Happy New Year to me, Happy New Year, Happy New Year, Happy New Year to me." And I got some good Southern loving that night, Chuck. I fell asleep in his big, strong arms. And then about midnight, I awoke to a strange, strangling noise. And I said, "Honey, are you okay?" And he didn't answer me. So I turned on the light and I saw that he couldn't answer me because his tongue was turned upside down in his mouth and he was clutching his throat with both hands and his right leg was thrown up over his left shoulder. And I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it was way bigger than me. So I got out a phone and I dialed 911. And because I live in a really small resort town, Chuck, everybody showed up. The firemen, the paramedics, the sheriffs, the troopers, they were all there. And it's a good thing they were, because it took 6 grown men to pull my husband out of that posture and strap him to a gurney. Mission, this is EMS 4. Do you copy? Copy that, 4. Yeah, we have a 55-year-old male, possible CVA. Do you copy? Copy that, 4. Transport hot. We'll be ready for you. And off they went. I woke my son, who, with all the men in the house, all the radios crackling, had never woken up. And to this day, I think that's because there are some things that a 15-year-old boy just isn't supposed to see. After I woke him, we drove to the hospital. And when we got there, we found out that his dad was having a massive stroke, that a 5.5-inch clot had flown from his left carotid artery into his brain, and that they needed to do emergency surgery to try to get it out, and that they didn't know whether he would live through the night or not. But the stroke neurologist said that even if he did live, the man in that room would not be the man that I had known at 10 o'clock that night. Too much damage had already happened. Well, my husband survived that stroke. And he was so physically strong that he was able to recover the use of most of his body. He had to fight so hard for months to learn how to talk again, swallow again. But he never was able to really think again. The damage was just too great. And the doctor said it was a fluke, that it would never happen again. And then 10 months later, on the night of my birthday, Chuck, it happened again and again and again. And that time he didn't make it. And that's how I became a widow at age 55 with a 15-year-old son. And it was that experience, Chuck. It was losing my husband, having a teenage son to rear on my own, that made me begin to look for ways to save myself, because there weren't resources out there at the time that could help me. I did bereavement counseling, and that helped a little bit with the grief, but it didn't tell me how to turn my upside down life right side up again. And so I took the training to become a certified grief recovery specialist and got my certification and began figuring out how in the heck to rebuild my life and how to help the over 1 million people who will be widowed in the United States this year rebuild theirs.
That is so powerful, Donna Marie, that I knew that your husband had passed, but I never knew the story.
Right.
So,
well, Chuck, we live in a death-phobic society. Okay,
well,
it's not surprising that.
Not for me, but I have to explain why. I'm in the middle of reading a book called Proof of Heaven. And it's written by a neuroscience, much like your scientist, much like your son. He's Harvard educated. He's actually a neurosurgeon. Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. So that's where I am right now. And it's a great read about the fact we don't have to fear death. The loss for the people remaining is so tough, but we as individuals don't need to have that fear. Right. So you have grief retreats. Do you have sponsors? We can't mention buy here or any of that. But
right. So the way that this works is, of course, now I'm not holding retreats in person, but yes, hospices, hospitals, churches, those kinds of groups sponsor the retreats. And it's a gift to the widowed people in their community. And we come together for a full day and we share our stories, because most people, Chuck, have never had a chance to completely tell the story of their loss. And then we spend the afternoon talking about ways to do self-care and to turn our upside down houses right side up again and to reclaim a life for ourselves as solo people.
I have to go beyond just you as a storyteller. You as a human being, Donna Marie, makes such a difference in so many lives because of your sharing of your vulnerability through this incredible gift that you have of combining music and story and acting. And I'm just overwhelmed by you, by your story, and by your contributions. We have no idea, folks out there, how fortunate we are to have Donna Marie here to help so many other people.
Oh, thank you.
You also wrote a book, I believe. It's called The Widow's Tale. Tell us.
No, The Widow's Tale is actually the name of my retreat program and my online program. I wrote a book, it's brand new, just hot off the presses, called Navigating Loss, a Survival Guide for the Newly Widowed. And it is meant to be used as a 3-month-long bereavement support resource. It's an actual how-to book. It contains in it a lot of neuroscience that I've been turned on to by my son, Mr. Science, and also things that I've researched myself. Neuroscience, if I had a chance to do it all over again, I would so become a neuroscientist, because it's just fascinating stuff, as you know from having read Proof of Heaven. And now I'm in the process of creating a series of videos, a 6-week series to go along with that book, so that with the book and the video series, especially during this time of isolation from COVID, hospitals and hospices and churches synagogues can actually provide at-home comprehensive bereavement services for the newly widowed. I'm really passionate about that. And so that's how I'm spending my summer vacation.
I'd really like to look at your book. I'd like to find out where I can find your book. Can you share with all of us how we can find your book?
Sure. Well, my book is kind of universally available. You can go to awidowstale.com and you can order it there. You can go to any independent bookseller of your choice, Malaprop's here in Asheville, and they can order it for you. It's also available at, of course, Amazon. So it's kind of everywhere right now. Hospitals, hospices, synagogues, churches also are able to purchase it in bulk along with the video series and offer it as a gift to the newly bereaved in their care. So that's really my ultimate plan, is for the book to be sponsored and given as gifts to the newly bereaved. Because what happens when you're newly widowed, Chuck, is that your world just implodes. You make it through the funeral, which is where most people publicly see you for the first time after your loss. You make it through the memorial service or the funeral, any type of wake or shiva. You make it through that by adrenaline. And everyone tells you to be okay, so you are okay. And then about a week after the death, the cards stop coming, the casseroles stop coming, the relatives start calling, and all of a sudden you go to this place called Gone, where you realize this is permanent. This is not going away. And I'm here by myself. Everything about my life has changed now, societally, familially, parentally, sexually, every aspect, financially, every aspect of my life has changed. And then it's too much change. You can't take it all in at once. And widows and widowers just implode for a while. And that's why it really needs to be a gift from people who care, because they don't have the energy to go find it.
And again, the title of the book
is Navigating Loss, a survival guide for the newly widowed.
Okay. I hope the people that are listening and they're watching on Zoom remember that and are able to find it. So again, just wonderful. How can people connect with your online programs? You mentioned that because of COVID, almost everything now is online. So, and my guess is probably before COVID and after COVID, you'll still have some online stories and information. So how can people connect with you?
Right. Well, thank you for asking about that. And first off, I think we're in a post-COVID world already. I don't think we'll ever really go back to live events the way that we did before. I think it's been our first huge experience with real infectious disease, and I think it's taught us all something. And we've learned, oh, wow, I can do this from my living room. I just turned Chuck on, on the radio, or I just turned Chuck on Zoom, and I can turn Donna Marie on Zoom. There she is. So first off, I'm on YouTube, of course. Who isn't on YouTube? And that's Donna Marie Todd, Donna Marie Todd on YouTube. I am at donnamarietodd.com, and you can go there and see me telling stories and learn more about my work and keynote speaking for conferences and storytelling for festivals. If you want to learn more about the online programs that I offer for widowed people, you can go to awidowstale.com. And you can always start with the book, Navigating Loss, a Survival Guide for the Newly Widowed.
Well, you mentioned you tell at festivals, and you mentioned so much of what you do. Can you share with us, have you received any awards or recognition for your work?
Wow. I have, well, my first retreat was sponsored by the National Storytelling Network. They honored the work that I was doing with widowed persons. So that was an award. Getting that grant was very nice. It was a member's grant, so that was great. Other than that, I'm not really like an award-winning person. It's just I haven't sought that really. I've kind of been too busy doing the work itself. And I used to when I was in Grand Opera, I used to think, you know, it's all about how many people have seen you and how many awards you've won. And I mean, I won everything as a kid. I was a vocal prodigy. So, I mean, maybe I just did my award thing, you know, before I turned 16, I guess.
Yeah.
But, you know, I used to think that was really what it was all about. And do you hear me? Do you see me? Kind of thing. And now I realize that it's all about each life that we encounter.
Yes.
Are we a positive influence in that person's life or
Yes.
not?
Yes.
And are we being an authentic person in life? And does that give everybody else permission to be that? So that's kind of where I am now.
Donna Marie, I think your gift is such a reward. And I'm going to assume something here that's pretty easy to assume. Everyone that's watching this and listening to this, their award to you, their reward is the impact you've had with your stories. You don't need anything else. You don't need the Oscars, the Tonys, or any of that stuff. All you need is the reflection from other people, how you've impacted their lives.
Thank you.
So what's next on your storytelling agenda?
Well, COVID not happening and the creeks don't rise, as they say. Next, I'll be going to Hawaii in February to present some Widow's Tale retreats and to perform.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Donna Marie, it has been such a pleasure and such a learning experience.
Thank you.
Actually, I have a little bit of tears welling up after your story about your husband. But thank you so much for being my first guest on the very first episode or show of Storyville. I can't think of a better person to have had as a guest for this show. So from the bottom of my heart, and literally from all of my heart, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck.
Well, and with that, folks, we still have a little bit of time left, but what I thought we could do is, in that time, share with you some of my own experiences in storytelling. I'm not going to tell you stories, but just to show you how accomplished and how professional Donna Marie is, you're about to hear a little bit of a different entry point into storytelling. Like I said, I use storytelling in my classes, and before that I was in sales, so I definitely would use storytelling in sales. But when we retired in 2008 and moved to Asheville, there was a void in my life. So in 2012 at OLLI, and OLLI stands for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. To digress just a second, there are more than 120 OLLIs around the country, mostly associated with universities. They're on campuses. So it's about continuing learning. It's about mastering the third stage of life as we retire in age. And it's just such a resource. So I took a class taught by Jay Fields on storytelling, and I was hooked. And then we both know David Joe Miller, and he attended one of my earlier shows. And then he put me on some of his shows. And that's really, for me, where it all began. And it continues this day and every day, because like you say, Donna Marie, storytelling is in each and every one of us. We each have stories to share. And just as you did, and as I have done, as we both continue to do, by sharing, we're making the world come a little bit closer together, and that gift of empathy spreads. What a wonderful thing that you do. And I've just learned early on that it's something that we all can contribute. So again, thank you. And just to let you know, this is Chuck Fink, and I'm going to try this for the first time. I've got a song here, and I don't know if it's going to work, but it's the song to take us out. And it's by Queen Bee and the Honey Lovers, and the song is called Asheville. But before I play that one more time, you're listening and watching WPVM FM 1037 on your radio dial and globally at WPVMFM.org. And now let's see if we can go home with, I just blew it. Let's see if we can go home with Queen Bee. There we go. Whatever you come from, it has for your welcome. Listen to it. And with that, thank you, Donna Marie, and thank you all for listening and watching. And this has been Storyville on WPVM. So long. And thank you, Donna Marie.
You're welcome.